Good morning, everybody. Like to say welcome to this HNES Heat Network Efficiency Scheme sponsored event. We're going to be talking to you this morning about an introduction to carbon accounting and Scope 3 emissions. My name is Will. I'm going to be hosting today's session, and I'm joined by a range of colleagues from both GemServe and from Bramble, who are members of the team that run the Heat Networks Efficiency Scheme. Next slide, please. Yeah, today we're going to be giving you an introduction to carbon accounting and Scope 3 emissions. So hopefully that's why you're all here today. The purpose of today's event is essentially to give you a bit of an introduction, as the title suggests. This is a technical and complex topic, so we're not going to be able to cover everything. But I think between us, we're going to hopefully be able to give you a bit of an overview of what Scope 3 emissions are, and to talk to you a bit about how some of this might apply to the work that you guys do in your organizations running and administering heat networks. Next slide, please, Bobby. So yeah, I'm doing the welcome and agenda. So if we move on again, today's meeting is being recorded. So this is for a couple of reasons. One, we might want to show this again to other prospective applicants. So this is the idea. If you could please keep yourselves muted to limit disruptions. If you're not speaking, please turn off your webcam. There's a Q&A function, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat whilst the speakers are talking, and we can come and pick those up. And the seminar, as I said, is recorded, and we'll distribute the slides after the session, so you have them to refer to later. So I hope that's all clear. Next slide, please. So the team today, I'll introduce, but obviously the speakers as they come on can introduce themselves. So as I say, it's a mixed team today. Myself, Poppy, and Richard from GemServe, and Richard's going to be talking later on about Scope 3 emissions, is our kind of ESG and Scope 3 accounting expert. And I'm joined by colleagues Megan and Palomi from Rambolt, who again work in Scope 3 emissions and carbon accounting. So we're going to be hearing from Megan later as well. Next slide, please. So the idea is that today I'm going to be doing the introduction for the first 10 minutes. Then I'm going to hand over to Megan, who's going to give us a nice overview of Scope 3 emissions and potential data sources for Scope 3 emissions. And then lastly, I'm going to hand over to Richard, who's going to be talking about Scope 3 measurement in practice for heat networks stakeholders. And then lastly, we're going to have 20 minutes of Q&A. If we've got 20 minutes worth of questions to kind of answer as best we can any questions that you might have about some of the issues that will have been raised in today's session. You will, of course, and we'll share in the chat and potentially at the end of the presentation our contact details. So if you want to continue the conversation, or you feel like you need any help or support with Scope 3 emissions and carbon accounting, you can get in contact with us, and we can help you outside of the session as well. So that's the plan for today. And I think if we move on to the next slide, I'll be handing over to Megan very, very shortly. Yeah, but the key thing and the reason that we're doing this, just to make everybody aware, is we have social value commitments as people who are administering the heat network efficiency scheme as part of our contract with HNES. So this is part of what we're doing in terms of supporting you guys, applicants, and the supply chain to reduce and measure your carbon emissions. Slide, please. We want to, and as I said, this is all about supporting the objectives of the scheme to reduce carbon impact of heat networks. To be able to reduce something, you need to be able to measure it, and Scope 3 emissions are notoriously difficult to measure. We also want to support you guys to evidence the carbon reduction achieved over time through the HNES scheme. If you measure it as an organization, we can hopefully measure the impact of what we're doing as a scheme. and also to improve the carbon literacy of the heat network supply chain. So this is just generally helping you to understand carbon emissions, how they work, and how you can implement them as organizations. So that's important too. Next slide, please, Bobby. And also because you told us you wanted to know about scope 3 emissions. So about a year ago, when we were coming up with our program for social value and thinking about meeting this commitment, we asked all of you what you were interested in and what you wanted to know about. And actually, most people were either somewhat familiar or not familiar with scope 3 emissions, which kind of indicated that actually you needed a bit more information on it. And actually 68%, so a comfortable majority, suggested that you were either neutral or extremely not confident in understanding of quantifying scope 3 emissions. So there was clear demand and a lack of understanding, or at least a lack of confidence in talking about and applying scope 3 emissions. So we want to try and address that today. And without further ado then, and to help us to address some of that lack of knowledge and understanding and confidence, I'm happy to hand over to Megan to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Will. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to meet you all. I'm Megan. I'm from Ramboll, and for the past couple of years, I've been focusing on greenhouse gas accounting and decarbonisation and stakeholder engagement. So today we're going to give you an overview of the scope 3 emissions and the relevant data sources. And just to note that it might seem like a lot of information, but you guys will have a copy of this after the call. So without further ado, so to begin with, shall we go to the next slide? Thank you. We'll start with a quick recap. So as noted, we had a call previously where we went through scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So if you were unable to attend that webinar, we'll just quickly go through these. So for scope 1 emissions, this refers to direct sources that are owned and controlled by your company. So you have control over how much fuel you use. For scope 2 emissions, this might include any emissions that are associated with energy use. So electricity that you use to run your facilities or any steam, heat or cooling use. And then we've also got scope 3 emissions, which will be the focus of today. So we're looking at indirect emissions from activities from assets not owned or controlled by your company. So these are segregated into what we call upstream and downstream activities. So we'll be going into a bit more detail about what these are later on. And whilst we will be going through each category, the activities and the applicability will vary from company to company. So we're going to be giving some examples today, but as we'll mention, the list isn't exhaustive. It's purely to give you guys some ideas and context as to what these category slides might look like. Next slide, please. So why should we calculate scope 3 emissions? So there are plenty of reasons why, but we've narrowed it down to 4 here, as you can see on the screen. So firstly, for risk management and reduction of emissions. So it can be used to help you identify risks associated to emissions, whether these might be economic, environmental, or social risks. And then, of course, the opportunities for reduction. It's also a tool that we use to track progress. So you can use a baseline from your inventory to track changes in emissions over time. This is also important as it allows you to establish targets and the subsequent actions that you might need to take to achieve these. And then, of course, the area that everybody likes, cost savings and efficiency. So inventories are a great space to recognize and realize opportunities for cost saving, such as energy bills and procurement costs. So as I mentioned before, these are only some of the reasons that we calculate scope 3 emissions, but they ultimately all feed into the role we have to play in decarbonisation. So this is a nice visual of the scope 3 categories. So this shows you the split of upstream activities of your business and downstream activities. So this visual is showing you the disclosure rate in 2020 for the different categories, and these rates are only increasing. So this is great news, of course, as it allows us to increase transparency and then also for those setting decarbonisation targets. So this slide is just to reiterate the importance of scope 3. So they do often represent the greatest share of corporate emissions. So these graphs are taken from CDP technical note on the relevance of scope 3 categories per sector. And as you can see across the majority of them, Scope 3 emissions tend to be the largest sector. So for example, we have the real estate sector as an example. So this has capital goods and downstream leased assets as big contributors. So for example, for capital goods, which we'll go into a bit more detail on later on, building developers must report embodied carbon of their builds. So despite the challenges of addressing indirect emissions, Scope 3 has a huge potential to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, and it also has substantial business benefits. So without further ado, we'll start going through the categories. So this is the first category in the upstream activities. So we're going to be running through details, data requirements, any key considerations, and some examples. There are nuances associated with the boundaries of what to include, what don't you need to include, and these will be covered a little bit later on in the presentation. But for now, we'll be giving you some examples specifically relating to social housing providers, NHS trusts, and local authorities. Please note that whilst we do have examples for these, the main details can apply to most organisations. And so we'll go on to category 1. So category 1 refers to purchase goods and services. So purchase goods and services is defined as greenhouse gas emissions from the production of products purchased or acquired by the reporting company in the reporting year. So also for services as well. So it is what it says on the tin, and that goods refers to office and lab consumables, software, water. Services might be things such as legal fees, cleaning, consultants that you might have. So looking for typical data requirements, we might look at financial data showing spend. So this will be your OPEX report. So we try to align this. If you have activity data, that's great. But if not, the majority of companies that we see at the moment are still using financial data. So spend for considerations. So this is to be disaggregated as much as possible. So we'd like to see line by line what the kind of spend is to be able to calculate accurately. And then data that you shouldn't be including in here is anything like employee salaries, rent, tax, or spend on data which is included in other categories. So for example, electricity would be captured in your Scope 2. And then for water, because this data usually is provided to companies in activity data, we'd like to have the actual activity data for water. So examples of what this might look like for social housing providers. So for example, this might be end of tenancy cleaning services, any white goods that you supply, any furniture for communal areas or furnished units, any office supplies. We've also got for local authorities, any uniform and safety gear for staffs, PPE, maintenance supplies, waste management costs. For NHS trusts, you might also be looking at medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, any security and consulting services. And then if we go on to category 2. So category 2 is very similar to purchase goods and services. So this refers to the emissions for the production of capital goods purchased or acquired by your reporting company in the reporting year. So this is any goods that your company owns as fixed assets. So what might that include? It might be machinery, vehicles, any IT equipment. Similar to category 1, this typically uses financial data. So rather than your OPEX, we would be looking at your CAPEX report. And then for key considerations, again, disaggregation is key here so that we can apply the right emission factors. And then for examples, so for social housing providers, this might include things such as construction services, machines, items needed for building new units, any major refurbishments for energy efficiency, and building community facilities such as playgrounds. Then for local authorities, this might include construction and maintenance of housing in community areas, any repairs to roads, investment in communal waste treatment and energy. And then for NHS trusts, this might include things like MRI machines, construction of new hospital wings/clinics, upgrading of infrastructure, and then modernising the emergency vehicle fleet. So here is an example of the emission factor categories that we would use for category 1 and category 2 if you would use spend data. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the types of services that we look out for. So for example, accounting, bookkeeping and auditing services, tax consulting services. And then on the right-hand side, we have an example of the goods that we look for. So for example, you might have electrical equipment that you purchased, any soft drinks, any furniture. So these are just a small snippet. And for fuel energy related activities, so we commonly refer to this as FARA. So this is any greenhouse gas emissions from the production and transportation of fuel and energy consumed during the reporting year as reported in Scope 1 and Scope 2. So for details for this, we would typically use the information that is provided from Scope 1 and Scope 2. So examples of what this might include, say for category 3 emissions from gas, boiler, electricity and cooling used for heating residential units, any emissions from vehicles used for maintenance and management of the property, emission from electricity and heat used in management offices, fridge and freezer units used for furnished housing. And then for NHS trusts, this might include hospital boilers, any emissions from emergency vehicles, electricity used in operated buildings, purchase steam/heat used for sterilisation and heat. And then for category 4, so this refers to upstream transportation and distribution. So greenhouse gas emissions from third-party transportation and distribution services purchased by the reporting company in the reporting year. So this is referring to any transportation of goods that you might have purchased, so referring to courier and logistics services. So data requirements that we might look at for this is distance traveled and transport mode, or the fuel consumed and fuel type. We do also have second choice data, so if you're unable to get activity data, you can provide financial data showing spend. So key considerations for this category is that it is likely that the transportation of the goods purchased by the company is already included in category 1. And data from suppliers can be difficult to get, so it's important to give yourself time to get this information when doing an inventory. And for examples, for social housing providers, this might include the delivery of construction materials for housing development, and for transporting household appliances from manufacturers to housing units, any logistics that might be involved in maintenance and operations. For local authorities, this might include the delivery of maintenance materials, again, from manufacturers to housing units, any delivery of office supplies, and then equipment to various local authority offices. And then for NHS Trust, this might include the delivery of medical supplies, equipment, and pharmaceuticals from suppliers to hospitals/clinics. The category 5, so this is in reference to waste and operations. So this refers to greenhouse gas emissions from any waste that is generated in operation in the reporting year. So for waste, you might include things like waste disposal from renovation projects, waste disposal from provider offices, housing estates, tenant homes. So the data requirements for this can vary in what we tend to get. So first choice data would be the type of waste, so whether or not this is general waste, hazardous waste, the quantity/volume of the waste, and then any disposal methods. So it'd be good to know whether or not these particular waste streams are landfilled, whether they're recycled, whether they are composted. And then again, if you don't have this data, we can accept financial data showing spend on waste management. Any key considerations for this is that quantity and type are important. If you don't have the disposal method, we can make an assumption using benchmarks. Spend data will be the cost invoice from the waste disposal company if you do have that information. And then you can get this data from your waste provider or from your financial data. And then for NHS Trust, this might look like clinical waste, pharmaceutical waste, hazardous waste, such as chemicals used to clean laboratories, defective medical equipment, and any medical devices that are disposed of in the reporting year. And then we've got category 6, which is in reference to business travel. So this is any emissions from the transportation of employees for business-related activities. So this includes employees being transported in planes, trains, buses, even trams, passenger cars. So any business travel that's completed in employee-owned vehicles and fuel/mileage is expensed, or taxis. So for data requirements, we would be looking to understand what the travel mode is, the distance traveled, or the fuel consumed. And then if you're unable to provide that, we can accept financial data showing spend per transport mode. And then key considerations is that all modes of transport are considered in this category. If they're not listed here, it's not an exhaustive list. It's basically any form of transport that can be taken. And then spend data will be the cost of the transport, e.g. the cost of the taxi, cost of the train ticket. And you can get this data from your travel providers or from your financial data. So examples of this might include for social housing providers, travel from maintenance to housing units, for property inspections to development sites. For local authority, this might be staff and consultants attending meetings with contractors, architects, and participating in any form of conferences. And then for NHS trust, this could be traveling to different hospitals and clinics for inspections, and then attending meetings with healthcare providers and contractors, or attending any healthcare conferences. So employee commuting, category 7. So this is emissions from the transportation of employees between their homes and work. And so it's what it says. So transportation of employees from home to work by vehicles or any other modes of transport. The type of data that we require for this is normally activity data. So we would be asking for the number of employees per office and site, the number of days employees might work from home, and then the modes of transport and the travel distance per office or site per employee, and then the annual working weeks or days. And then some key considerations for this is that the more activity data we get, the more accurate the data will be. So we can use a mixture of actual and average data from desk-based research if this data is unavailable. And so you might be able to get this data from an employee survey, from HR data, or assumptions that you've made about your team. So examples might include emissions resulting from employees traveling to work by either car, public transport, bicycle, or walking. And then covering both on-site staff such as property managers or housing officers, and those working in administrative roles at local authority offices. So, as mentioned with the first choice, that was the previous slide, but the second choice, we can use averages. So we would be looking at the number of employees per site. So for example, you might have 30 full-time employees at the main office, and the number of work from home days per site. You might have 3 days on average across the main office. Mode of transport, 50% of the employees use car, 50% use train, and then average distance travel to the office and average annual working weeks. And then for a second choice of high-level estimates, so this might be that you provide us with the number of employees per office site, and then the number of days employees work from home with the office and sites. So for category 8, this is referring to upstream leased assets. So this is any emissions from the operation of assets that are leased by the reporting company in the reporting year and not already included in the reporting company's Skip 1 or Skip 2 inventories. So typically this data is included in your Skip 1 and Skip 2, but if it's not and it's in this category, then this would refer to any energy such as electricity and fuels and refrigerant use in serviced offices and other offices/sites with less operational control. For example, you might not have control over the electricity provider/type of energy. Data requirements, so this might be the electricity consumption data, heating fuel consumption data, and F-gas service records for the areas the company operates in. And then second choice data, if you are unable to access any of this, for example, your landlord might be unable to give it to you, we can use floor areas to estimate. Next slide. Thank you. So this is downstream activities from here on downwards. So this is activities after a reporting company has sold a product or service. So this refers to downstream transportation and distribution. So this is any emissions that occur in the reporting year from the transportation and distribution of sold products in vehicles and facilities not owned or controlled by the reporting company. So this is transportation of goods paid for by the clients or customers of your company. So data requirements for this might look like fuel consumption or distance traveled and vehicle type. Key considerations is here that the company does not pay for the transportation of products, as there's another category for that. So examples of what this might include for social housing providers and local authorities, this might be any distribution and transport logistics for downstream services delivered to tenants, e.g. costs for emergency call-outs. For example, a tenant is locked out of their property and paying a fee. Transportation of goods to tenants or residents, such as appliances, furniture, or fixtures for housing units. And then for district heat operators, this might be heat losses that occur whilst transporting the heat from the central plant to end users. And then for NHS trusts, this might look like medical equipment or pharmaceuticals to satellite clinics, and delivering home care products to patients or patient travel to hospitals is also included in this category. So this is just a nice infographic that shows the difference between downstream and upstream transportation and distribution. So downstream, if the company does not pay for the transportation of the sold products to the retailer, and then upstream, if the company does pay for the transportation of products to the retailer. So category 10, so this is the processing of sold products. So this is any emissions that might occur from products sold that require further processing, transformation, or they might be included in another product before being used by the final consumer. So this might include the electricity and fuel consumption. So the key considerations for this category is that this category includes emissions from the processing of sold intermediate products by third parties, and this has to be subsequent to sale by the reporting company. So the relevance of this category may vary for everybody that's on this call, but the key focus is on whether any sold goods undergo any additional processing before final use. So this category could be relevant to social housing providers like authorities and NHS trusts if you were to sell physical products that needed further processing. Say, for example, for social housing, this might be surplus construction materials or waste sold to another entity for processing. For local authorities and NHS trusts, this might be selling on recyclable materials or decommissioned equipment to third parties for processing or for refurbishment. And then for category 11, so this is use of sold products. So this is any emissions that occur in the reporting year from the use of goods and services sold by the reporting company. So data requirements for this might look at the electricity, fuel, and F-gas consumption. So key considerations for this category is that it's applicable to your company if there are use phase emissions. So use of the sold product emissions include the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and the end users. So you are required to report direct use phase emissions. However, it is optional to report indirect use phase emissions. So for social housing providers and local authorities, this might include selling of housing units under right to buy, so the subsequent emissions from using the sold homes, e.g. the electricity and heating. For NHS trusts, this might be the electricity and consumption of diagnostic machines sold to other healthcare facilities, so medical devices sold to patients which require energy, for example, charging hearing aids at home / home use blood pressure monitors or ventilators. And then for category 12, so this refers to end-of-life treatment of sold products. So this is any emissions that occur in the reporting year from the treatment of sold products. So the disposal or recycling of products when they're no longer usable. So data requirements for this might look like the total mass of sold products and the packaging for the point of sale by the company. So you should be able to get this from finance, and then percentage proportion of this waste being treated by different methods. So whether or not the waste is landfilled, recycled, whether it needs special treatment because it's hazardous waste. And then again, financial data by spend is applicable if you don't have this data. Key considerations for this category is that this category includes the total expected end-of-life emissions from products sold in the reporting year. So this is separate to waste generated in operations. So it can be easy to confuse the two categories. So examples of what this might look like for social housing providers and local authorities. So for example, if you were operating a district heat network, the emission from the disposal of district heat infrastructure provided to customers, such as heat exchangers or piping. And then for NHS stress, this might look like end-of-life treatment, for example, recycling, landfilling of diagnostic machines, or any sold surgical instruments or sold PPE. And then category 13, so this is the downstream leased assets. So this is any emissions that recur in the reporting year from the Scope 1 and the Scope 2 emissions of leases. So for data requirements, again, we would be looking at electricity, fuel, and F-gas consumption, and key considerations that this category is only applicable if your company leases assets out to tenants. And then these tenants are consuming fuel, natural gas, or electricity. Say, for example, for social housing providers and local authorities, this might include electricity from powering tenant homes and gas/heat consumed from powering tenant homes, and then any F-gases from supplied white goods, for example, fridges and freezers. And then for NHS Trust, this might look like fuel consumed from leased emergency vehicles to other healthcare providers. Any NHS Trust / buildings leased to other healthcare providers, so private facilities, electricity used to power leased diagnostic machines, and then any electricity used to power leased computers / laptops to employees. In category 14, franchises. So this one may not be as applicable to a lot of people here, but we'll go through this. So this is any emissions that occur in the reporting year from the operation of franchises, which aren't included in Scope 1 and Scope 2. So this is applicable to franchisers, for example, companies that grant licenses to other entities to sell or distribute its goods or services in return for payment. So this might be such as royalties or for the use of trademarks and other services. So you'd be looking at getting the electricity data, fuel data, any F-gas consumption. So if a hospital operates as part of a healthcare franchise network, emissions from the franchisee's operations would fall under this category. This is less common in hospitals in the UK, but it may apply to some healthcare models. Next slide. Thank you. And then our final category, so this is investments. So this category is for any emissions associated with your reporting company's investments in the reporting year. So for this category, you're looking at getting the electricity, fuel, and F-gas consumption of your investment companies, as well as the equity share. So it's important to note for this category that emissions are dependent on the equity share. So if you own 10% of the company, you only include 10% of the emissions. Examples for this may include investments in other companies, such as district heating schemes for social housing providers and local authorities, or for investment in medical research companies for NHS Trust. And with that, I'll be concluding our 15 categories. So it looks like a complex process and might seem daunting, but ultimately the key thing here is to just get started. You might think you don't have good quality data, but ultimately you can do estimates with your financial data and build your data quality from there on. There are plenty of resources out there and support is available for your Scope 3 journey. So thank you very much, and I'll pass this over to Richard, who will be covering some examples of the nuances around reporting and boundaries.
Thanks so much, Megan. Yeah, great coverage and some great examples at a corporate level of each of the categories. Good morning still, everyone. My name is Richard Hilson. I'm a principal consultant at GemServe, and similarly to Megan, I specialise in working on Scope 1, 2 and 3 calculation and reporting and decarbonisation roadmaps for public sector and private sector clients, and have had a little bit of history previous to my joining GemServe when I was in an NHS Trust as the head of sustainability, working on the installation of a combined heat and power plant and heat network for the trust. So some of the examples might be reflective of that because it's an area that I know reasonably well. So next slide, please. Okay, so what we're going to do is just to show a couple of examples based on a district heat network setup. Appreciate that quite a few examples in the heat network efficiency scheme might focus on a communal network, which would potentially involve something like a boiler plant room at the bottom of that building that's shown here in the slide under secondary distribution and tertiary distribution. But we're going to think about a wider picture, a district heat network, so we can look at some intricacies of Scope 1, 2 and 3 reporting in relation to that. Next slide, please. essentially as complicated or more than the options of between primary, secondary, and tertiary elements of a heat network is the ownership models. It's very likely, with the number of attendees on the call today, that we've got a number of ownership models of heat networks that you're working on, and typically these can revolve between the landowner or the leaseholder of the location where the energy centre is. So it might be an investment company, property company, or a local authority, NHS trust, or a housing association, for example. And then there could be involvement from investors, from lenders directly, from energy services companies, perhaps through energy performance contract, and the energy suppliers themselves, who are going to be in the mix, providing energy from source. And lastly, on the consumer side, it would tend to be similar stakeholders to the owners of the property. So what we've done is just to give some picture really of the types of ownership. It's certainly not all inclusive, but just to give some idea, there can be a fully operated model by a landowner, a local authority, for example, who owns and operates the asset, the network completely themselves, if they've got their own fully equipped estates team who can do that, all the way down to the bottom where the whole heat network might have been set up and invested in under a special purpose financial vehicle or a joint venture, and could be fully operated by an energy services company and under an energy performance contract linked to that joint venture. So there's a number of different combinations that we see coming through on applications, and there will be reflected in what I'm about to cover, that the contractual agreements in relation to who owns the assets and who works on them is a key source of information when you're thinking about how you look at your reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and your responsibility for reporting. Next slide, please. Thanks. I think I just lost signal for a second there. So in the greenhouse gas protocol, there are 3 reporting approaches used typically, and the reference here for heat networks is that, for example, the first one is reporting based on how much equity you have in an asset or a business, and in this case, for example, if you own 60% of an asset or a business, then you would take account of 60% of the emissions arising from that asset or that operation. And then the other party who has the 40% or multiple parties would take account of the rest. Then the alternative approach is one based on the level of control. So you can have equity share in a business or an investment trust, for example, and obviously have no financial control or operational control on the businesses that you're investing in. Whereas where you do have financial control or operational control, that is often the preferred method and recommended method for reporting. The difference here being that it's very possible that a local authority, for example, may have some financial control over some of the assets that are being operated by another operator, perhaps a leisure centre operator, where there is an agreement by which perhaps a local authority has the ability to influence some of the financial flows that are related to that operation, but may not have any operational control over the building or the assets. That would be purely down to the leisure centre. So those 2 organisations have different approaches, and for good, comprehensive but non-double counting reporting, it's essential that those entities speak to each other and look at who should be reporting under which approach. But organisations will generally pick one of these approaches depending on which is the majority type of control or equity model that they operate. It is complicated, and generally where it becomes relatively complicated, we lean back onto our financial colleagues and the international financial reporting standards to understand exactly how to report where there is a potential dispute or grey area. Next slide, please. So what we thought we'd do is just go through a couple of examples of typical types of heat network efficiency scheme projects. So the first one is, let's say, for example, there is an NHS trust that operates a district heat network. Its maintenance is perhaps done by its O&M contractor, but the NHS trust is the one who is purchasing the fuel source. And then it also, in this example, owns the heat network, and that heat network is also maintained by the same O&M contractor. And the revenue from the heat that might be sold externally to the trust, perhaps to residents of a housing association or other, would be retained by the NHS trust. So we can see our water pump there, just sort of left of centre of the graphic, just next to the number of small blocks of flats there. So let's see what happens when we look at the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions related to the NHS trust and the O&M contractor. So if you click on, so we see that once that water pump is replaced, then if we consider the NHS trust in the first year after this is done, Megan talked about fuel and energy related activities, category 3 of scope 3. So these would reduce for the NHS trust because they would be reducing the amount of energy required upstream in order to bring into the system. They would also be reducing their direct emissions of gas, assuming it's perhaps a combined heat and power plant, and also reducing their electricity consumption because the water pump, by assumption, is more efficient than the old pump. So they would also be reducing their scope 2 emissions. However, their in-year capital goods reporting for scope 3, all other things being equal, would be increasing because they would be investing in the water pump, which would come with its own emissions, embedded emissions in capital goods terms. And for the contractor who is installing the goods and services that they bring in to help them to install, so they would have a purchase goods and services impact on their greenhouse gas inventory. They'd also have an increase in capital goods or an impact of capital goods in relation to this project in their greenhouse gas inventory. And they would also start to be reporting on use of sold products because the water pump would be using electricity, and therefore that's emissions in use related to the water pump. And more widely, organisations, as Megan has covered, will be reporting on a range of their activities. So in relation to the particular project, the contractor would be using some form of travel for their contractors to get to site. So it could be business travel if the expenses are reclaimed by their teams, or if they're using a fleet that is owned or leased by the organisation, then depending on whether that's a fossil fuel powered vehicle or electric vehicle, they would report that under their scope 1 or scope 2 emissions. Equally, if they are increasing their use of fuel in year to be installing the water pump, perhaps previously they might have had a small maintenance van that went every 3 months or 6 months to look at the water pump. Now perhaps they need several teams to come in and work on the enabling works and infrastructure required to put the water pump in. Then all of these teams will be coming into site. So there will be upstream consequences from the fuel that they are using in their fleet to get to site. And then also there will be the upstream transportation and distribution of the water pump itself, but also those other purchased goods and services, or the goods that it's bringing in to deliver that water pump into the project. And then lastly, as Megan talked about, there would be waste generated in operations from if they are treating the waste that's being generated on site. If that's under the contractor's remit and is being contracted by them, then they would report on their waste generated in operations. But the consumer benefits from this change because the system becomes more efficient, and their ratio of carbon emissions to or their use of heat would be more efficient. So their scope 2 emissions of the consumer would be reducing, as well as the upstream energy source required to deliver that heat. But going on from that, if we click on to future years, then the NHS Trust, the base organisation, will see a reduction, continued reduction in the fuel and energy related activities, or a maintained reduction, I should say. Similarly, for their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, those would be retained year on year as reductions. And then that's likely they would also see, compared to years previous to the water pump being installed, let's assume the old water pump was pretty inefficient and needed lots of new parts and potentially some fairly substantial parts to be installed, then the trust overall would see a reduction probably in purchased goods and services and capital goods in relation to the installation and that particular area of the asset going forward. Whereas the contractor, who might be needing to come to site less often because the new water pump is more efficient and breaks down less often, would see a reduction in purchased goods and services as well as capital goods on their side, and potentially, if they're visiting site less often than they were, they'd have a reduction in their business travel or fleet and the related emissions to those, and also upstream transportation and distribution of items they would have otherwise needed to order and install, and also a reduction in waste generated in operations from the installation of small consumables, for example. And the consumer on the right-hand side maintains their benefit reduction in scope 2 emissions and the upstream source of fuel that's required to deliver the heat that they're receiving. So let's look at another example where there's a slightly more complex ownership. So if we consider firstly that this is a heat interface unit being installed or being retrofitted, repaired or replaced, let's assume that it's being replaced. So we can see there that the heat interface unit is in the secondary distribution area of the district heat network, for example, in a social housing owned area of the heat network. But let's assume that the base energy centre is a joint venture between an investor and a local authority. It's perhaps operated by an energy services company under an energy performance contract of some description. The maintenance, the O&M of that whole system is done by that energy services company, by the ESCO. And let's assume in this case that, as is sometimes the case, that the ESCO is also purchasing the gas and electricity required through the system to help to generate the power for the system. And the heat network itself perhaps is fully owned by the local authority and isn't invested in by the investor, but could be maintained by the same energy services company. And let's assume that the revenue is split 3 ways between the ESCO, the investor, and the local authority. So this can happen in a scheme. It's relatively rare, but we do see these more complex schemes being set up and maintained. So what happens here when we go to replace the heat interface unit, if we click on? So let's consider first the local authority and investor as their joint venture. So if they are able to use the equity share approach in their greenhouse gas protocol accounting for this particular project or the assets that they're investing in, then, as I said before, they would split the emissions according to their investment and revenue share. And then in terms of the purchased goods and services, if they are involved in the payment of those purchased goods and services and involved in how they are, there'll be a dependency on their relationship with the energy services company. So the question will be, are they contracting an energy services company as a service, or potentially are they leasing some of the assets to that energy services company? So there'll be a difference in approach there, depending on the contractual arrangement. But they will likely be reporting on the financial gain from their investment under category 15 investments. And then As far as the ESCO is concerned, then because they're buying and burning the gas in the combined heat and power plant, for example, for the system, then once they've introduced a number of heat interface units that are effective of which is reducing heat loss, then they will be requiring less gas to heat the same space, assuming all other things are equal. So their scope 1 emissions will reduce. Their scope 2 emissions will also reduce for the electrical, mechanical parts of the system that won't need to work quite so hard. And the upstream fuel that is coming into the system that they are acquiring from from the base source, from the gas field, that would also reduce because the kilowatt hour consumption heat consumption would reduce. And potentially, if they are leasing the asset from the local authority and investor, then their upstream leased asset reporting would reduce if that's the arrangement that they've got. And similarly to our last example, for the installation of the heat interface units, then there'd be travel involved by the engineers. The same upstream emissions would also be reduced from the fuel that they're consuming in coming into site. And there would also be upstream transportation and distribution of the goods from the first or tier 1 distributor or manufacturer to site. And there'd also be waste generated in operations, as there always is in delivery of projects. And there would also be, as in the last example, increased purchase goods and services and capital goods related to the heat interface units that are being installed. Same for the consumer. Their benefit is to have a reduced scope 2 emissions and the upstream fuel and energy related activities that are entwined within that. So if we then look, it's a similar picture. If we look forward, then depending on the arrangement, ongoing, assuming maintenance is lower, there's less requirement for travelling to site for maintenance and upkeep of the heat interface units, which we would assume were needing a lot of maintenance previously. Again, the investor and the local authority would be splitting the emissions ongoing in the same way, according to their share in the investment. And then the energy services company would maintain the benefits of reduced scope 1 emissions and scope 2, and they're contrary to the actual implementation of the capital project, then assuming that they were previously having to do a lot of maintenance, in the same as the water pump example, they'd have reduction in their business travel or scope 1 or scope 2 emissions related to their fleet, also to the purchased goods and services that they have been using perhaps previously to keep the system going, and also reduction in general upstream transportation and distribution of small, I'm not sure we'd call them consumables, but infrastructure related consumables that they perhaps had been needing to order on a more regular basis. And then lastly, the consumer continues to benefit, and I think this is at the core of the heat network efficiency scheme, that the consumer is going to continue to benefit from reduced scope 2 emissions and the upstream emissions related to that. So I hope that made some sense and useful to look at a couple of examples. There are, of course, many types of technology that your organizations are installing, which is fantastic to see. And there are any number of complex investment and co-ownership models to consider. But our objective is to give a bit of an idea of how to think about how you might account for your emissions. And the one point to note is the reason for giving these examples is not necessarily to say that a corporate level scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting would have to include project by project, but that considering projects in themselves, as well as at a corporate level, gives a number of advantages and starts to take organizations into life cycle thinking, which is really beneficial for looking at material use across the whole life cycle of a particular installation or material. So next slide, please. Now, as I've been going through, you've probably had going through your mind some of the challenges that might be involved in this type of reporting and looking at it on a project by project basis. So one is the boundaries. I gave a very brief overview of the different reporting approaches that you can use, and therefore what the boundary of one organization would be to another, and avoiding double counting. The second challenge is, I think, data accessibility, quality, and availability. So there'll be very different quality of data that might be available dependent on what monitoring systems you've got for the energy use, and that will have a very different comparison to the type of estimates and that might be needed for waste generated in operations, for example, or for business travel, where the data might not be quite so secure and direct on an activity basis. Yeah, for business travel, for example, it might depend on whether you're using fuel cards or whether it's on an expense basis, whereas generally your energy use coming into an energy centre is pretty well monitored, and then from there it would be dependent on the monitoring and measurement of heat used in the system. Another challenge could be related to the data, could be stakeholder engagement, to understand what consumption looks like, to understand what the activity is related to coming into the system if it's not your activity. And as Megan went through, there's a number of ways of getting around that or getting the ball rolling by using financial data rather than potentially activity data as a starting point. This all does require resource to start with, to look at mapping the system, understanding who is going to be reporting on what, and then ongoing having a way of ingesting the data to be able to report on it, and then making sure that things like the emissions factors are updated every year. And based around, the center of all of that is the knowledge of the methodology, which we've covered in briefly today, that should be followed for compliant greenhouse gas protocol reporting. But there are significant opportunities. So one of these being that there is a new collaboration that can take place, where there's a shared motivation between partners to be able to both show the results of the investment and the projects that are being undertaken, but also there's a shared motivation to perhaps find areas that of interest that could be used to looking forward to new projects and better ways of doing things that make the data acquisition easier in future projects where you're working with partners. Many of the projects may come under a public procurement exercise that may not be within the heat network efficiency scheme, but more widely, where contractors will be asked to be measuring the social value that they're providing and have given in their tenders as measures they're going to take. So effective measurement of your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions allows you the ability to report back on your social value delivered. It can understanding more about the system and the wider emissions related to the delivery of the system and a contract going forward, often identifies future projects that can be worked on that could be within the heat network efficiency space, or could be in another area of low carbon delivery. For example, perhaps electric charging points, and those sorts of things might spin off working together and looking at your emissions in more depth. Overall, bringing this data together and being able to paint a picture of the effect of the whole project in the first year and ongoing will deliver positive communications about the projects, the sector, as well as the heat network efficiency scheme as a whole, and data helps us to do that. And then the last two are the flow of financial investments into the green sector is based largely across six areas of green positive impact, whether that be circular economy or reduced use of fossil fuels and more use of renewables, etc. So the ability to communicate this data and the effect will attract increased investment into your business or the sector as a whole by having better data and being able to label it in an easier and more accurate way to allow the investors to see how much they're investing in the schemes and the benefit from it. And then lastly, better communication of our scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions and the effect of our projects will increase our ability to advocate to government for increased funding for these types of schemes to be increased and to roll on for many years to come. So hopefully that gives you a good overall understanding of scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and a bit of a dip into where it might be relevant in the heat network space.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Megan, as well, for giving us such a kind of comprehensive and thorough overview. We have obviously got a QA function, so if you don't want to necessarily speak, then please do put your comments or your questions in the Q&A section. We'll get round to them. We have now enabled functionality so that people can come off and actually put your camera on and ask a direct question. If you would like to ask a question, please put your hand up, and I will pick you kind of each in turn. We'll start by addressing a question that is in the Q&A because I don't see any hands coming up yet, which is a question from Kevin Gardner, Richard, which I assume is for you. And it says, it does look like in the NHS example that both the NHS trust and contractor are accounting for the capital purchase. So I don't know if you are able to reflect on that question and clarify that, Richard.
Yes, Kevin. Ideally, you would only have one entity who would be reporting on the capital purchase, but in reality, unless in reality, often in my experience, capital projects can be accounted for on a financial basis, and they might have other elements wrapped into it outside of the actual asset. So you would be purchasing a capital project, and the unless you have the data specifically related to the water pump, for example, it would be the water pump plus installation of the water pump, and it might be considered as a lump sum, a financial sum, and considered capital under the NHS's financial rules. But then also the contractor would be purchasing the capital good. So that's the reason why I put both. But the ideal situation, you're absolutely right, would be that only one party would be accounting for the capital purchase. But it's the same for purchase goods and services. It can effectively repeat down the line. Because there will be different levels of effectively margin as those goods come through. That helps.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. Do we have any questions, guys? Any thoughts? Anything you want to ask the team? We've got Palomi on the call as well, who's one of the kind of scope 3 experts from Bramble, as well as Megan. So this is a really great opportunity. If you've got any questions about your specific context, about your business or organization, or anything that the guys mentioned that isn't clear, now's your chance. So I'll wait to see if we've got any hands up. Any thoughts?
There's a question from Miles in the Q&A. Will, did you see
that? There is a question from Miles, which Megan appears to have answered, but maybe you'd like to give a verbal response, Megan, which is regarding scope 3, category 13, downstream leased assets, specifically for electricity. What level of data granularity is needed? Should it be building level? e.g. total megawatt hours consumed across all properties in the period, or is the property level data preferred? Would using CT clamp meters on the main cable into each property be an acceptable approach for monitoring electricity consumption?
Yeah, I can just quickly go over this. Yeah, that's a great question. So for data granularity, we generally would be asking for property level data. So property level data allows us to see, say, for example, one property might have disclosed their data, but another property might not have. So it allows us to see that data gaps. In terms of actually getting that data, it can be challenging. So for clients in the past, they've been able to provide us with floor space. So we have used floor space to estimate electricity consumption and also fuel consumption using benchmarks. So as mentioned, Miles asked whether or not CT clamp meters would be an acceptable approach for monitoring electricity consumption. So this isn't a method we have seen before, but this would be acceptable. Alternatively, smart meters as standard utility meters can be used. Something that we've also recommended, as well as that landlords go back to their tenants and they ask them to disclose, so voluntarily disclosing what their electricity and fuel consumption are. Other information that we would also look for would be refrigerants. So refrigerants refers to any of the F gases used in fridges and freezers or any cooling inside units. So there might not necessarily be aircon units, but say, for example, if you have residential units or even office spaces, then fridges and freezers might be applicable. So getting that information can also be difficult. So asking tenants to voluntarily disclose what information they have around that is useful. But then again, if not, we can estimate using benchmarks. Thanks very much, Will.
Well, thank you, Megan. And it seems though we don't have any questions from anyone or any hands up that I can see. I think given that that is the case, that we can potentially think about wrapping up the session, which is a bit of a shame that no one's got any questions, but I'll take it as an endorsement of how comprehensive Richard and Megan you've both been in your presentation. So that's really excellent. I'd also like to thank everybody for coming to this session this morning. Obviously, it's now this afternoon, but thank you for coming along today.
Well, sorry for interrupting. We do
Sorry,
have one
Paloma.
question. We have a
Oh,
question
do we?
from
Sorry,
Kevin.
apologies. Another
No
question
problem.
from Kevin. Sorry,
So
apologies,
yeah,
Kevin.
I can read
you
that
have
out. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
So his
that'd be
question is around data source, which gives emissions data relating to capital goods. Essentially, you're asking if there are any emission factor database for capital goods. There are a few available, largely spend-based, not necessarily activity data-based. The majority of these emission factors, unfortunately, sit behind firewalls. Not firewalls, price walls. So you do need to purchase some data sets, emission factor data sets, in order to access reliable emission factors to account for these. But there are a few emission factors, such as the Climate TQ, if you haven't heard of that. That's an open access data set, although the caveat there is that the emission factors aren't the most up to date.
excellent.
I hope that answers the question, Kevin.
Thank you, Palomi. Wait to see if we have a response from Kevin. Hopefully that's helpful, Kevin. Got one comment here. Yeah, thanks.
There's potentially an
Kevin.
alternative approach depending on how much you're spending, I guess, which is to look at the materials that are that the capital good is made of, and then to look at default values for the particular materials to get an idea of the emissions. The issue is that if you have two data sources, then it's likely that the emissions will look very different. So a methodology or a justification for using a combination of both would be useful. But we have seen that done because the spend-based approach can give you a very different answer. And if the materials, if it's a relatively simple simple product in terms of materials, then that can be a good way of working out what the base emissions have been to come into the factory for a particular capital good.
Thanks, guys. Really important. We had a kind of, I suppose, more of a comment from Jane saying, "Thank you. For me, it's rather overwhelming. We're connecting to a private heat network and hadn't thought we would be accountable for the carbon emissions." I'm reflecting that you'll need to, that Jane is reflecting that she will need to revisit this later. I mean, invite you guys to sort of comment on the specific case of connecting to a private heat network if Jane's potentially listening, but also it would also be helpful, I suppose, to have some reflections. And I know you did touch on this, Megan, in your section, which is getting started and that process of it being overwhelming and how can you get started? Where might you start? So first, any thoughts on the private heat network point? And then if not, Richard, Palomi, Megan, any thoughts on getting started and your kind of top tips might be quite helpful for the people on the call.
I can have a go. Any sort of greenhouse gas accounting is daunting. It is daunting for us as accountants as well, despite having a bit of a head start in terms of knowledge and the expertise and methodologies. But despite that, we still find it a daunting experience. So we totally relate with your sentiments there. But as Will said, we have to start somewhere. There are some simpler approaches that you could adopt in your first year of accounting, and then look to refine that in subsequent years. So yeah, that would be my tip, is to make a start somewhere. There's lots of resources available out there as well, or you could get external help from experts like Bramble and GemServe, and we can support you to whatever capacity that your budget allows. So the tip is make a start, and you'll be surprised at how comfortable you are with progressing and refining that inventory over time.
Yeah, thanks, Palomi. It is a process, and I think it's one that people evolve with and get more detailed over time. Richard, have you got anything to add? Any thoughts on getting started?
I think I'd only suggest that when you do go to get started, that it's quite useful to have a look around and see if other people are reporting their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in the sector, and it might give you some reassurance that everybody has probably started from a similar place to you, and you'll soon notice that if you look at it with a sort of clear-eyed view, wanting to find the absolute answer, then there's very few scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions inventories that do that yet. There's almost all of them have spend-based average elements to them. Even some of the more sophisticated areas, some of the big food manufacturers, for example, are still grappling with this. So it's a journey. I think is probably the best way, but it's definitely doing a little bit of peer review will give you a bit of comfort that that you're not getting it wrong. It's just the estimation method and the accuracy will improve over time. But there's definitely a relatively simple starting place, as Palomi has said.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Richard. Seeing what other people have done, how ambitious have they been able to be, what's been able to be achieved in your sector and in your industry is a really helpful way of thinking about it. And also, I suppose, don't be afraid to talk to those people who've done the work and had their experiences and what pitfalls they found. And to Palomi's point, obviously, and this isn't the sales pitch, but there are organisations out there that can support you to navigate the process. So don't feel daunted by that, and feel free to reach out. And we'll share, by the way, our contact details in the chat, so that you can reach out to us to follow up on the call after this session if you would like to do so. And we'll obviously, and we may be running sessions like this again in future. I think we've got one more, and we may rerun the scope 3 session if there's interest in that. So there's more support available and out there if you need it. Are there any more questions for anyone on the call? Final call for questions, and if there's not any, then we'll wrap up, and I'll give some concluding remarks and reflections. Well, it doesn't look like it. I know I said it didn't look like it last time we had questions from Kevin, so maybe I'm wrong, but it looks like we've had all the questions we're going to have today. So thank you again to Megan and to Richard, particularly for their contributions today. Thank you guys for attending and for your time and attention. We will, as I promised, I know there's lots of interest in the slides and seeing the slides again. Just to be really clear, we will share the slides after the session with you. We may even be able to share a copy of the recording of this session if you would like it, and that's helpful to you. As I said, we'll likely send around a survey asking for your feedback on this session as well. So that would be helpful if you could please complete that for us. That's for our reporting to HNES and also to help us to improve these sessions in future, and also just to give us some confirmation about what we're doing right and what's going well, because that's also helpful for us to know. So please complete that as and when it comes around to you. Also keep your eye on the HNES social media feed, because I think like I alluded to earlier, we've got another session to run. We may run another Scope 3 session. It will probably be very similar to this one, but if you have questions for us and are interested again, then that might be another place to look for more help and advice and support. So thanks very much from us at Gem7 Ramble and the general HNES team, and we will see you again hopefully at one of the next sessions. So thank you very much and have lovely days, everybody.